Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto went through puberty again. Our heroes did not come from a future where everything has gone horribly wrong. They did not travel back in time to save the world from a bleak or miserable fate. As a matter of fact, all they want to do is find a way back home as soon as possible. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 20, The Reunion, Karaoke is Cruelty. Tenten huffed irritably, scowling as she walked to the training ground. She was not in the best of moods, and a part of her would have preferred to stay home and take the day off. It was irksome to go down there every day and see Lee and Neji, especially since she wasn't too happy with either of her teammates at present. But she couldn't just skip out on her exercises. Guy-sensei might have primarily been focusing on improving Lee's combat skills for the third test, but that didn't mean Tenten or Neji could, or would, skip out on their own training. Even if Lee was the only member of their team to have made it to the third and final phase of the Chunin exams, they still had their own pride as ninja. And on the bright side, Tenten told herself, at least, that four-eyed Floozy was too busy with her personal training to come down. Otherwise she probably would have killed someone by now. Stupid redhead, the brunette muttered, thinking of the bespectacled Uzumaki. Who does she think she is, barging in on our team dynamic like that? She spun a kunai between her fingers, flicking it out of its holster and tossing it idly from one hand to the other. Her cheeks were the faintest shade of red beneath a morning sun, and gravel produced a muffled crunching sound under her sandals. Hi-ya! Tsuo! Hi-ya! Dear-ya! Or-ya! Watcha! In the near distance, the sounds of grunted kie and thumping fists could be heard. Lee and Guy's voices carried a good distance in the heat of training, two hot-blooded men pushing themselves to their uttermost limits. And their exercise regimen had become more insane than ever before, because apparently Lee was only now at a level where Guy could train him seriously. Tenten really wasn't sure what to think about that. If she hadn't been training alongside them for the past 3 weeks, she probably wouldn't have thought it possible for those two to train even harder, but she had seen the proof with her own 2 eyes. Even with as harsh as Lee's training had been before the Chunin exams, nothing could compare to the grueling hell he now underwent every day. She was equal parts amazed and disturbed by the sheer intensity of their training. It made all of their past exercises look like mere kiddie stuff. The clearing where Team Guy practiced came into sight. Lee was sparring with Guy-sensei, going through his taijutsu forms, building his physical power and endurance to even greater heights. It was a little awe-inspiring to watch, and Tenten felt her face burn from something wholly unrelated to the sun's rays as sweat glistened on ruddy flesh and muscles flexed under skin-tight spandex. Quietly coughing into her fist, the weapon's mistress sheepishly turned her gaze elsewhere. She observed Neji at another end of the clearing, the prodigy pushing himself to the limit with some rather harsh strength-building exercises of his own. Tenten watched him for a moment, admittedly impressed by his grit. After his frankly humiliating defeat at Lee's hands, Neji had redoubled his training thrice over. For all the genius's fatalism and talk of predestined outcomes, he seemed stubbornly determined not to lose to Lee a second time. Even if she was still a tad sore over Neji's insensitive behavior during the preliminaries, Tenten could at least respect that kind of resolve. He was working hard to improve his skills and cross the gap that had emerged between himself and Lee, a curious reversal of their former positions. Tenten smiled a bit in spite of herself. Absent-mindedly, she flicked a kunai 30 meters into the bullseye of a training target. Perfect accuracy. She may have been very ordinary and unremarkable by most standards of measurement, but there was one thing she did better than anyone else. Nobody threw knives like Tenten. In another, grittier setting, that marksmanship and proficiency with assorted weapons might have made her a force to be reckoned with, a veritable combine harvester of death-dealing pointy metal. In a world of giant monsters and superhuman freaks like this, however, her talents were very ordinary and pretty much just a novelty. But weapons handling was her specialty, and she did it better than any other genin. By the time she was finished, the practice targets would be fair-riddled with iron. Thunk. 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 Kunai impacted dead center on every target. Front, up, left, down, right, back. Over the shoulder, under the elbow, around the waist. She threw darts in every direction, steadily and incrementally honing her ability to aim from peripheral vision and identify targets at first glance. It was a steep learning curve, but Tenten didn't miss a single mark. This was her element. Excuse me? A voice caught Tenten off guard, distracting her from her target practice. She stumbled, surprised, and spun around to face the speaker. Recognition was immediate. Karen. Tenten said, seeing the bespectacled Kusa Kunoichi. She narrowed her eyes. What are you doing here? Humph. If you need some advice about what to do about your hair. Karen scowled and pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. She took this greeting with all the grace she could muster, dauntlessly ignoring this attempt of provocation. Dark eyes flicked over to where Lee was sparring with Gai-sensei, and her expression softened. The taijutsu specialist was absorbed in his exercise, and he didn't seem to notice Karen's presence in the training ground yet. The redhead blushed. I'm here for Lee-kun, she mumbled. He's pretty busy, as I'm sure you can see, Tenten responded, pursing her lips. I don't think he'd appreciate being interrupted, even if it's, you. Karen fidgeted. Are you sure? He usually seems to enjoy my company. Maybe he does, usually, but Lee takes his training very seriously. So I've seen, Karen mused, smiling. But I think he'll make an exception for this. For what? Tenten asked, frowning curiously. A family reunion, Karen said. I asked him about it last week, and he said yes. To going as my date, that is. A kunai handle bent in Tenten's crushing grip. A date? She said. Her mouth curled into a grimace that might have been a half-hearted go at politely smiling. I see. You want to take that Lee on a date? Humph. Good luck with that, girl. I don't think he even owns any formal wear. I've already rented something in his size, Karen replied, her smile equal parts knowing and smug. He wanted us to wear matching outfits, and suggested T-Had I take care of the details. I think he'll clean up very nicely. Tenten crossed her arms over her chest. Her lips twitched as though they wanted to become a pout or a scowl but were prevented by their owner's pride from following the expression through. I see. Well, then. Don't let me get in your way. Go ahead and fetch Lee for your little date. She said this slowly, her tone carefully neutral. The aggression in her eyes was communicated only passively, a snide remark here disguised as something innocuous, or an understated smirk there after looking for a few seconds at some aspect of the other girl's dress or appearance. It was a curious aspect of the female social ritual, this feigned politeness covering bared fangs with ersatz smiles, a subtler, more affectless approach than a hot-blooded guy like Lee would understand or appreciate. Tenten wasn't a master of such hollow niceties by any means, but she could still do at least this much. Karen retaliated in kind. I will, the redhead said sweetly, her tone dripping with iced honey like a hornet's venom. And that was a rather weird mixed metaphor that didn't really make much sense when you thought about it, but it sounded kind of cool. Thank you, Tenten Redheart. She once more adjusted her glasses. Lenses flared in the morning light, becoming opaque discs of white, and her lips melted briefly into an unmistakable smirk. Then the saccharine smile returned, and she flounced gaily, girlishly off towards Lee. Tenten glared at the back of the other girl's head for a moment. An eye twitched with irritation. Spinning on her heels, the brunette stomped over to her other teammate. Neji! She snapped, interrupting the Hyuga's exercises. She grabbed him roughly by the collar, the expression on her face rather deathly frightening. Look alive, Pell. You're coming with me. Wah. Neji gulped, caught squarely off balance by this sudden, firm declaration. A dusting of the lightest pink colored his face. Tenten? Where are we going? From the opposite end of the clearing there came a cry of Karen-chan, and from the corner of her eyes Tenten espied their green-clad comrade practically tripping over his own feet to greet the bespectacled lass. The brunette's eyes narrowed infinitesimally, watching as Lee threw his arms over the redhead's shoulder and pulled her into a warm-looking bear hug. Tenten's grip on Neji's collar tightened. To crash a party, she said with all the grim determination of one declaring a full-out war. Neji blinked. Wait, what? In a fairly nice part of Konoha, a certain rec center had been booked by a certain group for a very specific pair of events. 2 family reunions for 2 practically extinct shinobi clans. Uzumaki and Uchiha. They were being held in the same location, at the same time. For all intents and purposes, it was a single thing. And it was something of a minor to-do, as well, garnering a fair bit of gossip from curious citizens. There was much speculating when people first heard of it, and village customs had a hell of a time vetting all the foreign guests. Some folk griped about the timing of this event, and others muttered about Naruto, plus a few stubborn old-timers who grumbled suspiciously about Sasuke and alleged clan elitism. But regardless, the day of the party came without trouble or incident, the date planned for roughly a week before Stage 3 of the Chunin exams. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the invitations had said it would be starting. Outside, the weather was lightly overcast. Sunlight came down only intermittently through the thin cloud cover. Pleasantly cool, if a tad bit dreary for some. Sasuke and Naruto stood inside the door, the hosts of the 2 functions dressed in formal men's kimono bearing the heraldic brands of their respective clans. Smiling politely, one wider and more cheerful than the other, they greeted their guests with everything from bows to waves to handshakes. Yo, Anoka. How's it hanging? I hear you've been working with experimental summoning jutsu. Ah, Kaide-san. I'm glad to see that you were able to make the journey, despite the distance. Karen. Haha, so good to see you. And bushy brows, too. Man, I would not have expected you two to hook up. So Danzo won't be coming after all? I wasn't sure, despite the RSVP, well, it's a shame either way, but I do understand that he is a very busy man. Next to the hosts were their dates, Hinata and Sakura, dressed in yukata. They also helped greet the guests, smiling and making small talk as they led them inside. The 2 young girls made a very positive impression with their sweet and friendly demeanors. Karui, is it? It's a pleasure to meet you, I must say. Ah, and these must be your teammates. I'm honored, Red Heart. Greetings, Himuro. Hee, and I bet this is your wife, Setsuna. How's the weather in Konoha treating you two? This is a pleasant surprise, Natsuhi-san. We weren't sure if you'd be able to make it. A shame to hear that your son couldn't come. Taro Yamada, huh? I don't recall that being one of the names on the guest list. I do see something of a family resemblance, though. Especially around the cheekbones. The Uzumaki attendees were numerous, an eclectic mix of people from all over. Several redheads from many lands had gathered once more under the banner of the former Uzushiagakure's most famed shinobi clan, getting together mostly for the free food, and partly out of curiosity about the host. Rock Lee was there with Karen, he being the censor's date. A genin squad from Cloud accompanied their red-headed friend Karui, with their sensei escorting them, dubiously, incognito. A freelancer by the name of Anoka chatted amicably with a Star Village kunoichi who was officially dead. A bouquet of origami flowers lay by the guest registry, an attached letter giving the formal regrets of its senders at being unable to attend, while a dark figure with blue hair skulked about on the edges of the group. Kakashi Hatake was present on the Uchiha side, invited on the grounds that he possessed the Sharingan, and was apparently thus an honorary clan member. Similarly had Danzo Shimura been invited, though the man had bluntly declined and RSVP'd only to say that he was a very important, very busy man with no time for the puerile jests of young boys. Most of the other Uchiha attendees were civilians, merely very distant relatives whom Sasuke had tracked down over several days of tirelessly perusing birth records and genealogy charts, people mostly descended from lines that had split off from the Uchiha decades ago, possessing neither Sharingan nor aptitude for ninjutsu. The majority of them were older citizens of the Land of Fire, and the few younger ones who were present were primarily female. And among these civilians was one individual of otherwise nondescript appearance who happened to bear a passing resemblance to one Itachi Uchiha. Which, to be fair, was mostly because he had dyed his raven locks brown and popped in blue contacts so as to covertly enter the village as part of a minor noble's protection detail, half on the job for Akatsuki, and half as an excuse to check up on his little brother. Tsunade cast a critical eye at her surroundings, appraising the various people attending the reunion. It was a real motley assortment on the Uzumaki side, a motley mix of freaks and weirdos gathered together for a single purpose. Compared to that pack of eccentrics, the Uchiha seemed downright normal. Probably because they were really just very distant relatives with almost no actual connection to the old clan. She took a sip of sadly unspiked punch and hummed. It's a lot less stuffy than I would have expected from an Uchiha clan function, the blonde mused to herself. Jiraiya sipped from his own cup and grinned at Tsunade. His eyes dipped down to her cleavage a little longer than she liked, rather irking her with his roving gaze. Well, it's an Uzumaki soiree too, and we both know how they used to party, the Toad Summoner roguishly replied. Tsunade glowered at her old teammate. His presence at this reunion was an unexpected turn of events, annoying on many levels, and dreadfully inconvenient in a few different ways. Especially since he was standing by the punch bowl and hitting on every halfway attractive, possibly single woman to come his way. Those womanizing old habits of his peeved Tsunade something fierce, and not just because of how big a pervert he was. Yes. I still can't believe those kids would have the balls to do something like this, though, she muttered. Why? Jiraiya wondered. Because most of the Uzumaki had been scattered or in hiding. Or because all the Uchiha here are just distantly related civilians. Tsunade shrugged. A little of both, I suppose, but there's also the fact that some people rather high up in the village might have reason to take umbrage at this, she mused. You know, since they're holding this reunion a week before the Chunin exams. Security is probably throwing a fit over so many unauthorized foreigners waltzing into the village right when they're at their busiest with prep work for the final test. Haha. Yeah, probably. I reckon it's all in good fun though, Jiraiya said with a laugh. Those kids don't seem too hung up over what other folk think of them. They're the sorts to just do what they believe is right with no regard for protocol or decorum, I bet. They're idiots, Tsunade grumbled. And that's a pretty big problem in its own way, although it really isn't any of my concern. Sakura's probably the only intelligent one of the lot, and even she seems pretty out there half the time. Maybe, Jiraiya shrugged. But I like M. They've got chutzpah. Guts. His hand moved. Glomp. Tsunade twitched, her cheeks reddening. Jiraiya. She said lowly. Take your hand off my ass before I remove it for you. Permanently. Right. Yeah, of course. He sheepishly let go. So, you work with, summoning jutsu, was it? Natsuhi of Hashigakure, legally dead and living in self-exile from her village, smiled nervously as she attempted to make some small talk with one of her apparent relatives. Oh, yes. It's a very interesting field, Anoka Uzumaki replied, smiled cheerfully. Although I'm mostly just on staff to restrain the more dangerous specimens, I still see all kinds of fantastic things. Natushi blinked. Wait, specimens? She said. Of course. Anoka nodded. It's kind of top secret, but they've been working on developing new summoned beasts using bioengineering and genetic manipulation. Really, it's the most fascinating work I've seen in years. We've even cloned a number of extinct creatures for use in the experiments. Do you know, they actually devised a sort of medical jutsu to reverse nuclear entropy just so they'd be able to work with dinosaur DNA? It's incredible what you can do with a mix of science and ninjutsu. Almost terrifying. She beamed. Natsuhi found herself at a loss for words, unsure what to say in the face of the other woman's excited technical jargon. Weakly, she curled her lips into a half-assed smile and nodded, the old reliable standby of anyone trapped in an awkward situation. I see, she said. That sounds interesting. That was a lie, of course. In reality she thought it sounded mind-numbingly boring. Natsuhi was a soldier, after all, and not a scientist. But Anoka seemed to take Natsuhi's perfunctory reply as an invitation to go on further, and she began talking about chemicals and proteins with longer names than most secret jutsu, carrying on with anecdotes about the repetitive minutiae of laboratory work, and spouting off useless little factoids on all kinds of things wholly irrelevant to the majority of ninja. She waxed philosophical on amino acid chains, gushed like a giddy schoolgirl about the interruption of cellular mitosis and grafting of foreign tissues into vital systems, chattering and chirruping over the hybridization and chimerization of various disparate life forms. Natsuhi quickly regretted trying to start a conversation with her. "Someone, please help," she though disconsolately as Anoka yammered on with impenetrably incomprehensible techno-babble. "Please, someone, anyone, save me from this." "Ah, Anoka-san. Did you say you work with teratogens? That must be inconvenient, you know, if you felt like starting a family." Natsuhi blinked, the sound of this new voice seeming like a chorus of angels to her ears. She turned to face her savior, and saw a pink-haired girl who couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old. "Oh, yes," Anoka said, turning as well to face the newcomer. "It's practically a necessity, considering our field, you know, creating brand new life forms and all that. But I do love the work I'm doing there, even if it's just restraining the more dangerous specimens. The lab where I work probably has one of the most extensive stores of the most virulent poisons in all the world. Helitoxins, colchicinoids, beta-alkaloids, the works." The pinkette giggled. "Lucky you," she chirped. "I wish I could have access to half that stuff. The most advanced medical work is as much about harming as healing, you know? But the poisons I get to work with are downright crude compared to that." Natsuhi's sweat dropped. These two were really hitting it off. How about that? But wasn't this girl the Uchiha boy's girlfriend? Funny how these sorts of things worked out. Neither of them seemed to be paying her any heed, thankfully. They were completely absorbed in their discussion, comparing their respective fields of expertise and talking about their work experiences. Apparently the girl was already a very accomplished medicnin, despite her youth. Sighing in relief, Natsuhi took the opportunity which presented itself and slipped away before she could get dragged back into the conversation. Karui stared balefully at her alleged date, the chubby and mild-mannered lad cheerfully chowing down handfuls of lightly salted potato chips. Her left eye twitched. How the hell did I get roped into this? This was merely rhetorical, of course, not even posed as a question. She already knew how it had happened. Her teammates were assholes, that's how. That, and B-sensei had a twisted sense of humor. First they'd pestered her into RSVPing to that invitation and saying that of course she would attend this bloody stupid reunion for a family her kinship to which she tried to downplay as much as possible. On Samui and Amwa's parts, this had probably been done out of the assumption that connecting with her distant relatives might somehow be good for Karui. Or something. Sensei, on the other hand, had obviously just used this reunion as an excuse to get out of the village for a while. And Karui was still pretty sure that, while she and Samui and Amwa might have somehow gotten permission to leave for this event, there was no demmed way on God's green earth that the Lord Raikage would have ever given his brother leave to come along to Konoha, Chunin exams or no. So they probably had a lecture from a furious Isama to look forward to when they got home, too. Fantastic. But worse still, her teammates had then taken a look at the +1 on the invitation and promptly insisted that Karui would need a date. She had fought this for months, from the day she got the letter to the day they arrived in Konoha, but Amwa and Samui had refused to relent. Probably they saw it as a good laugh. Karui had just found it obnoxious. By the time they arrived for the reunion, she'd grown utterly sick of their casual remarks and subtle suggestions, to the point where she felt ready to flip her lid and throttle her teammates. It finally got to the point where she'd just lost all patience, snapped, and decided to simply invite the first guy her age she ran into. Anything to silence those prats. So, naturally, she'd crashed into Tubby over there, Choji Akimichi, as he'd introduced himself, approximately 3 seconds after making that decision known to her teammates. Just her luck, really. Samui had smirked at Karui, and Amwa had visibly struggled to stifle his sniggers. B-sensei simply gave her a thumbs up. Like he was telling her to go for it, even though Karui very much did not want to. If asked, after the fact, why she had followed through on her declaration and asked the boy out, she would insist vehemently that she had done so only under the most extreme of duress. She would fidget slightly and avert her gaze while saying this, however. Now, in all fairness the boy did seem nice enough. He'd been pleasantly surprised by her invitation, and had in fact gone to some trouble to make himself presentable, although his lamely slicked hair and stiflingly formal clothes gave off the impression that his mother had played a sizable part in dressing him up. So that detracted a few points. And Chuji was hardly the suavest fellow Karui could have imagined. He looked about as awkward in those clothes as she felt on this date, though, so they could at least bond over their shared discomfort. And on the plus side, he did know all the best local delicacies. Karui took a bite out of a fresh spring bun, soft and warm with a hint of sweetness that she couldn't quite place. Yes. If nothing else, Chuji could identify the best snacks and refreshments on site. His taste in potato chips left something to be desired. Karui was a consommé girl all the way, but he otherwise seemed to have a good sense for food. And it's not like he was really painful to look at, either, or a complete bore to talk with. He was a very good listener, but straightforward with his opinions. Which was something Karui could appreciate. "These hors d'oeuvres are pretty good, I've gotta say," mused Anko Mitarashi, snatching another tiny sandwich off a waiter's tray. "Fancier than my usual fare, but not too rich. I think I could eat these things all day." She popped the finger sandwich into her mouth, pausing only to remove the olive-bearing toothpick. Kakashi watched in morbid fascination as Anko messily devoured the appetizer. She was grinning from ear to ear, seeming unbothered by the conflicted expression on Kakashi's face as the man waffled over whether the sight of crumbs falling into Anko's cleavage ruined his appetite, or aroused him. His appetite. Whether it aroused his appetite. Yes, after all it's not like he got, especially, excited from staring at Anko's cleavage. Nor was he, using the crumbs falling down the front of her dress as an excuse to look at her tits for an extended length of time. Nay, he may have read porn in public, even around minors, but Kakashi was a gentleman, goddammit. A real classy sumbitch. He didn't need an excuse to stare at a nice pair of melons. "Yes, they're very good," he agreed with an absent-minded nod. "Very sumptuous and perky." A pause. Jerky. They taste like jerky. Yeah. The good stuff. Real juicy and, Kakashi coughed. Right. Anko laughed. "There's some real nice meat between these buns. Although the sauce is a bit saltier than I'm used to. Very thick, too." "I imagine it's an acquired taste," said Kakashi offhandedly. "Iruka and Shizune seem to be enjoying it quite well." "Geez, you can even see some of it on her cheek, too," Anko observed. "Doesn't that girl have any shame?" Kakashi side-eyed Anko. "Like you're one to talk," he thought. Out loud, though, he said. "Love does funny things to people, I guess. And look, Iruka's wiped it off for her." "Well, good for him," Anko snorted. "It's still his fault that stuff got all over her in the first place." Kakashi shrugged. His eye chanced to peer a bit downward in Anko's direction, and he saw a bit of the sticky white condiment in her cleavage. "Ah, you've got some sauce on you as well." He pointed to her chest. "Right there, between your..." Anko smirked. "Do I, now?" She looked down. "Well, so I do. Mind being a pal and getting that for me?" "I don't have a napkin," Kakashi said. "Lick it up, then," Anko said, shrugging. "I don't mind." Kakashi's sweat dropped. "This is just a ploy to see under my mask, isn't it?" He sighed. "Maybe." Anko winked. "Or maybe I just want you to." Loud music promptly boomed through speakers, drowning her out and making it impossible to tell what she said exactly, although her meaning could still probably be inferred from the context alone. "Tukudakako eruko hintoni. Hitari mata hitari tachie garudushi." Kakashi winced, and stuffed a finger into one of his ears. "Sounds like Naruto has found the karaoke machine," he mused, rueful. "What?" Anko asked. "You'd gladly do what to my Kurika isudake no Fudendori. Kochuga isu. Yunbai iize, are you ready?" Naruto belted out the lines as they appeared on the prompter, standing up on stage with Killer Bee, Rock Lee, and an utterly bemused Neji. He pumped a fist into the air and sang enthusiastically into the mic, grinning from ear to ear as he indulged in what was practically Japan's national pastime. Not that he actually knew what a Japan was. Karata juya fura waso shindu ni. Hagashiku uchinarace stomping. Tizutsuki uga kaja call me. Kawaraza yuruga nutsukemu story. B and Lee eagerly joined Naruto for the next bit, and Neji awkwardly stumbled along through the lyrics after them, with no rational cognizance as to why on earth he was doing this. Maybe Tenten's expectant gaze had something to do with it. That, or Hinata-sama's chillingly warm smile. Come on. Everybody stand up. Ajiro Kiyo Ichiban no Jikinda. Mi Nimo Tamarenu Speed Hunter. Dermo Ga Mina Toriko Kanban, yeah. Come on. Karen was squeeing and gushing at the foot of the makeshift stage, clapping her hands and cheering as fervently for Lee as a fangirl for her rockstar idol. Hinata was more reserved, simply smiling and nodding her head in time with the beat. Tenten was looking a little pink-cheeked as she watched Neji, her lips pursed and arms crossed over her chest. Samui and Amwa were simply weeping tears of gratitude that this song was not one their sensei had written. Everybody hands up. Madashita na heroes come back. Zojouka's Yubi Oro countdown. Akos 3-2-1, make some noise. Iruka took a sip from his punch and sighed, shaking his head in something somewhere between exasperation and amusement. Shizune stood next to him, smiling and giggling at the spectacle the kids and that one cloud ninja were making of themselves on stage. They look like they're having a lot of fun, she commented. Yeah, they do, don't they? Iruka sighed, clasping his date's hand. I just wish he wouldn't make such a spectacle of it. That Naruto. I wouldn't call this a spectacle, Shizune replied. No one is even drunk yet. The party isn't being catered with alcohol, you know, he said. Since the organizers are minors. Trust me, Shizune wearily sighed, Tsunade-sama will find a way. Iruka looked at his date thoughtfully, the two of them dressed in simple formal clothes. You have it rough, don't you? He mused. I really do. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Timanaku nari hibiki kazema. Deja vu yuri mo gatsui shoujuki ga. Zenshinwo hashiri hanasan. Break it down. Killer B sang solo, his deep voice rumbling as he moved in time to the beat. His pupils watched, still relieved that B was not singing lyrics of his own invention. How do you suppose Karui's doing with her date? Samui mused. She's going to kill us when this is over, Amwa muttered. You know that, right? Oh, cool your jets, Amwa. She won't kill us, Samui said. I think she'll really enjoy her date. Ah, so she'll only cripple and maim us, then. Amwa replied. You're delusional. Samui rolled her eyes. And you don't know the first thing about a woman's heart, she rejoined. Amwa shrugged. Turn it up, hey kako eka? Sakenda kinu made no koto jie. Kawaru dero madamainu asui. Ko baridia furta omoi no bun made. Wow, this is some shindig, said unimportant, distant Uchiha relative number 1. I know, right? Said unimportant, distant Uchiha relative number 2. Have you seen that blonde by the punch bowl? I think she's taken. And 20 years younger than you, from the look of it. Well, sure, if you want to rain on my parade. Yeah, sure. Besides, though, aren't you already married? Yeah, with 3 kids. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate a nice view, you know. Ugh. Machinamata showtime Sedakai Roshukyume. Dochira ni katamu kushou urhei no yuk. Agira kaiteria kyounimo tsuburu. Nagashita chi to ase onor denugua. Neji sang, looking flustered and self-conscious with the mic in hand. He did quite well of it, showcasing an impressive singing voice despite obvious nerves and uncertainty as to what the hell he was doing on stage in the first place. Tenten watched and listened, a tiniest guilty smile quirking her lips. Sakura chuckled, looking up from where she was talking shop with Anoka to survey the singing youths. Huh. Did Hinata invite Neji at the last minute? I don't remember seeing him on the guest list. Anoka cocked her head. I have no idea, she said. I'm only a guest, myself. Ah, whatever. Sakura laughed. Doesn't really matter, does it? As long as nobody's causing any trouble. Yeah, Anoka said obligatorily. And honestly, I'm not sure I should even be such an expert on the stuff we're talking about, since I was only hired to restrain the more dangerous summons, but I guess you could assume I learned this stuff through osmosis from hanging around the actual scientists. Or something, I dunno. Huh. That kinda came out of nowhere. A shrug. It had to be said at some point, though, didn't it? True, fair enough. Negai mo pride mo fukum subit wo sada tagai no hago. Nasake wo kakataria dame ninaruzii. Tamode potential mental men. Tsunade scanned her eyes over the refreshment table for what had to have been the umpteenth time, a scowl curling her lips and wrinkling her nose. She looked annoyed, and it didn't seem like her irritation was a result of Jiraiya this time. Where's the demsake? She groused, folding her arms in front of her. I don't think there is any, Jiraiya said blandly, taking another sip of his fruit punch. Since the organizers are minors. There are laws to prevent that sort of thing, in case you'd forgotten. Tisk. What a load of bull, the blonde muttered. They can't seriously expect us to suffer through this blasted karaoke sober, can they? They probably do. Ugh, Tsunade groaned. Damn these kids and their damn music. Jiraiya shrugged. It's not that bad, he replied. Can be real nice with the right view. A vein throbbed in Tsunade's forehead. Damn it, Jiraiya. My eyes are up here. He gave her devil-may-care sort of grin. Yeah, so. Nico mo shikushi mo mata una hero. Hitaban dake no gorin, Roman hikau. 002 ne sunnan ja na sa. Kick on the corner. Mata teri ne ka. Next came Lee, jumping in with a rapid-fire barrage of lyrics, and it seemed doubly impressive coming from the polite, if hot-blooded, youth. Karen pumped her fists into the air and vigorously cheered him on. Hinata smiled. They're very good singers, aren't they, Tenten-san, Karen-ni-san? She said to the redhead and brunette on either side of her. Karen blushed and pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. She cleared her throat, a nervous tick. Why ask me? It's not like I've really been paying that much attention, she said, as contrarian as ever. Humph. I'm only listening because Lee is giving it his best. Not like I really like this sort of music, or anything. Tenten's sweat dropped. Hey, is that really how you roll? She muttered. When the heck did you turn alt tsundere on us, huh? Seriously. I can't even keep up with you weirdos. I bet Neji-san would sing much more boldly if you cheered for him, Tenten-san, Hinata offhandedly remarked, a glint of something innocently conniving in her smile. The brunette clammed up with a squeak. Itsumo Tachigo Hijou na Jinkaku. Mamoru no sa subit, like a Terminator. Yunkai, Gokai de Tatsu highlight, fly high yeah. Issou kono ba tatsuri daruzo. Around 1/4 of a blue-tressed head watched the party from the shadows, scraps of confetti drifting innocuously through the air. The eye and ear of an origami woman lurked outside the area proper, covertly spying on the participants in the proceedings. In this dark corner the presence of this partial head could be dismissed as a trick of the light, if anyone even bothered to actually look in that direction for more than a second. Very few had bothered, so far. A paper butterfly fluttered soundlessly onto the side of the floating partial noggin, resting in soft navy hair. It unfolded itself, then refolded into an origami flower. Konan narrowed her eye at a curious spot in the air. Shadows seemed to twist, the gloom warping as substance emerged from nowhere. Like a drain in reverse, a dark orange mask appeared around a singular void, the rest of a body spiraling in soon after. Crimson Sherry-non met a single gold eye, peering out from the only hole in that mask. Konan, a deep voice murmured. Madara-sama, a whisper that seemingly came from the air itself. She did not ask why he was here, and he did not ask why she was here. Each could guess well enough at the other's motive. Fair skin and silken hair peeled away in slips of paper. Konan took her leave. The masked man did not linger more than a moment longer. He picked out an unmistakable form among the crowd and nodded imperceptibly to himself. An eye narrowed behind a mask, and Obito Madara Uchiha shook his head once. Then his form swirled around that single eye, becoming wraith-like and intangible. He vanished shortly, that Sharingan eye the last thing of him to disappear. Naruto cocked his head up on stage, the motion almost imperceptible. Sasuke saw his cue. Everybody stand up. Ajiro kyo Ichiban no Jikinda. Mi nimo Tamarenu Speed Hunter. Dermo ga mina Toriko Kanban, yeah. A blue-eyed young man with straw-brown hair was somewhat surprised to see a pair of six-pointed stars with three black, tapered spokes within them suddenly staring at him from out of nowhere. Manga Kyushari Nan. All at once, his surroundings became morbidly dichromatic. Everything was a shade of red or black, with nothing but occasional splashes of white in between. Tsukuyomi. The young man frowned, seeming mildly perturbed. What's this? How? It's a long story, a boy said. Very, very long. Enough to fill 700 chapters of a weekly shounen manga, over 400 episodes of a half-hour anime, several feature-length movies, and a dozen or so OVAs of varying quality. Come on. Everybody hands up. Madashita na heroes come back. Zojouka's Yubi Oro countdown. Akos 3 2 1, make some noise. Sasuke Uchiha stepped out of the shadows, seeming to manifest from thin air. His eternal manga Kyushari-nan gleamed in the darkness of this illusory world. So let's just say these eyes are a memento of my dear, older brother. He smiled wanly, tilting his head slightly to one side. That sound okay to you? Itachi. A beat. I knew I should have taken Kisame's advice and cross-dressed. Yeah, that might have helped make the resemblance seem a little less obvious. Chapter 21, Why Naruto is a surprisingly good Hokage. So. With a naturally unreadable expression, Itachi stared at his little brother. Or, rather, the illusionary representation of his little brother. To think Sasuke had already managed to trap him in a Tsukuyomi. They grow up so fast, don't they? Yeah. Just to put it out there right now, I have no intentions of killing you. Itachi blinked. Well. How about that? This was not what he would have expected to hear. Maybe a furious, incoherent shout, yeah. An icy whisper declaring undying hatred, sure. Even questions about why he had done what he'd done, why not? Asking why Itachi had killed off the rest of their clan, you know. But, this was just perplexing. Itachi narrowed his eyes and frowned. He eyed Sasuke disapprovingly. Have you already forgotten, little brother, what I did to our clan? Humph. It would seem you are even more foolish than I had first thought. Sasuke waved a hand dismissively. This gesture drew Itachi's attention to the fact that this was the only hand Sasuke had on his person. Mildly troubling, though he had already known of this from certain sources within the village. Supposedly, the lower half of the boy's left arm had been lost in a mysterious training accident around the same time he graduated from the academy. Considering that Sasuke was also quite clearly in possession of the manga Kyushari-nan, a fact which pained Itachi most heavily since he was the one who had told his brother how to acquire those eyes, and basically stated flat out that the mangakyo was the only way Sasuke would ever stand a chance against him. He hadn't ever thought Sasuke would achieve it so soon. Well, considering this, Itachi figured that the training accident must have been something like an Amaterasu that got out of Sasuke's control. That seemed like the most logical explanation, all things considered. But then Itachi's thoughts turned, once more, back to Sasuke's earlier statement. He frowned. Perhaps I should refresh your memory. Sasuke could not afford to grow complacent. Not with the likes of Danzo and Madara still out there. Itachi's eyes flashed crimson, hurricane-spoked mangakyo coming to life. Their surroundings changed all at once, transforming from a community rec center into the Uchiha clan compound, littered with the corpses of their deceased relatives. Sasuke snorted. Almost as soon as it came into being, this image wavered. The surroundings Itachi conjured through his own Tsukuyomi vanished, replaced by a more natural setting. They stood on a cliff overlooking Naka River. Itachi's heart leaped into his throat. He beheld his late kinsman, Shisui, one eye closed and leaking blood from beneath its lids, standing perilously close to the edge and smiling wanly at a younger version of himself. Upon the brink he stood, weary but hopeful. There is no way to stop the Uchiha's coup d'état anymore. These words were ones Itachi remembered all too well. Civil war will erupt in Konoha, and other nations will seize on the advantage provided by our village's disunity. It will become a world war. It was morbidly fascinating. The scene was different from how Itachi remembered it, subtly so in a number of small details, mistakes which betrayed that this image did not come from his own mind, or the mind of one who had witnessed the actual event, but the fundamental import, nature, and meaning of what he saw could not be mistaken. When I tried to head the coup off with Kota Amatsukami, Danzo stole my right eye. He doesn't trust me, but I've chosen to protect the village in my own way. He'll probably try to take my left eye as well, soon enough, so I'll entrust it to you before that happens. Shisui raised a hand to his remaining eye. Itachi was frozen, unable to do anything but watch in disbelief. The slight differences in small details from his own recollection betrayed that this was not a vision plucked from his head by Sasuke's genjutsu, but, then. You're my best friend, and the only one I can count on. Please, Itachi, protect the village, and the Uchiha name. How? Itachi choked out, reeling. Sasuke, what? He whipped his head around to stare at his younger brother, that omnipresent facade of cool and collected composure shattering completely. His mouth was agape, his eyes wide in disbelief and confusion. 100 different conflicting emotions tore through him, a whirlwind of dismay and confusion. I haven't forgotten anything, Itachi. Sasuke whispered, his voice sounding deeper than normal for a boy his age, even by Uchiha standards. No, if anything I'd say I remember more than I ever did as a child. I could never forget what you did, not even after 30 years. Sasuke inclined his head. All at once, the boy changed before Itachi's eyes. He seemed to age by decades in a heartbeat, instantly maturing into the fullness of manhood. Itachi stared at a face morbidly reminiscent of their accursed ancestor, Madara. Lips quirked into a bitter smile. The man looked Itachi straight in the eye. The sacrifice you made for the village, for me? Itachi's blood froze in his veins. You, who are you? He gasped. A chuckle, mirthless and weary. Oh, a great many things, the man mused. An absentee father, a distant husband, a lousy friend and disrespectful subordinate, the second strongest ninja alive, Shinobi no Yami, and a hopelessly foolish little brother who trampled all over his elder sibling's wishes. The setting changed again, becoming a small sitting room adorned in the traditional style. The man knelt down, seating himself before a low table. I'm Sasuke Uchiha, age 37, and it's been close to 20 years since I last saw my big brother alive. Since the day I killed him and learned the truth. A pause. His expression turned sheepish. And kinda went full on Nukenin for a while, what with joining Akatsuki, killing Danzo, swearing to destroy the village, culminating in taking the Biju hostage, declaring my intentions to assassinate the 5 Kage, and attempting to launch a continent-wide revolution that would have destroyed the modern hidden village system and placed myself as the immortal, unquestioned ruler of the world who would have reigned over humanity with an iron fist so as to ensure world peace, or a serviceable facsimile thereof, forever and in perpetuity. Itachi gaped. Sasuke let out a laugh, a hearty chortle unlike anything his brother would have thought him capable of producing. Fortunately, he added, I had a good friend willing and able to knock some sense into that empty head of mine, even if it meant each of us losing an arm and nearly dying in the process. Not to mention an infinitely patient woman capable of suffering through my angst long enough to actually make me see the beauty in this world. His smile grew more wistful, almost dreamlike. A beat. Numbly, Itachi picked his jaw up off the table. This is a joke, right? Sasuke once more waved his hand dismissively. Do you know of anyone alive, in this time, who could actually control a Tsukuyomi better than you? Well, ahem. Itachi coughed into a fist. There is Madara. Tisk. Sasuke rolled his eyes. That Madeo died a decade before the Uchiha massacre. At least. The guy calling himself Madara right now is just his successor, a misguided relative by the name of Obito Uchiha. He has a different kind of Sharingan from you, me, or Madara, and only half the pair he was born with, besides. I'm not even sure he can use an ordinary Tsukuyomi. Itachi blinked. Calling one of the most famed and sacred of Uchiha Genjutsu ordinary in any context seemed unutterably bizarre to him. Only Izanami and Kota Amatsukami, to his knowledge, could be considered more extraordinary illusions, and one cost its user the sight in one eye, while the other could only be used once a decade unless supercharged with the Lord First's cells, and even then it would still be limited to only once a day. He frowned. I don't know. The acclaimed prodigy murmured, clearly skeptical. Sasuke rolled his eyes. The wall to Itachi's left promptly transformed into an animated, 3D pinup. A slim, fairly attractive woman who looked to be in her mid-30s, judging by a lightest smattering of wrinkles, frown lines and crow's feet, as well as a few stretch marks, here and there, which seemed to intimate a possible past pregnancy, smiled and posed suggestively, winking at Sasuke and silently giggling. Her hair was short and pink, distinctive, with a distantly familiar turquoise diamond mark on her forehead. Like Tsunade, in a way, although this woman's bust was a good few sizes smaller. Also, she was dressed in odd but a cheek-scorchingly skimpy suspender bikini that left far less to the imagination than poor Itachi was anywhere near comfortable with. It didn't help, either, that she appeared to be maybe twice Itachi's age, even aside from the fact that she bore an undeniably powerful resemblance to the lass who had introduced herself to Taro Yamada as Sasuke's girlfriend. So, seeing this woman in such scant array and suggestive posture felt awkward for Itachi on many levels, a multifaceted world of Ogodwa Tevendu and Don't Lukather tights. Itachi nervously cleared his throat. Peering askance at Sasuke, he saw a look on the man's face reminiscent of an expression he'd seen on their father, once, in happier days when the man had come home a little tipsy and in a very good mood after finally wrapping up a particularly troublesome case. Half-repressed memories of their Fugaku Uchiha leaning in close over his wife Mikato's shoulder and whispering things into her ear that made their eldest son wish he'd never learned how to read lips, fingers pinching places their boys had been taught to never touch on a girl, making the woman smile and arch her back with a not at all displeased look on her face, burst into Itachi's mind. He shuddered, feeling both disturbed and uncomfortable. Like he was a stranger intruding on something private. It also didn't help that Sasuke and this woman depicted in the image seemed to be only negligibly younger than Fugaku and Mikato had been when Itachi killed them. This was supposed to be his baby brother, right? Itachi coughed. Oh. Okay, he mumbled, feeling his cheeks burn something fierce. Suppose I believe what you are saying, Sasuke, and suppose I believe you really are a grown man in a child's body, my foolish Otauto 25 years older, mentally, than he ought to be. Suppose I trust that what you're saying is even possible. Assuming all of this, I just want to know, how? Sasuke shrugged. Time travel. Time travel? Itachi parroted. Time travel, Sasuke repeated. Presumably. Presumably. Said Itachi. Again, Sasuke shrugged. Presumably, yes, although I cannot personally say for sure. All I know is that one night I went to sleep an adult, and the next morning I woke up a child. Well. Itachi said. I don't see what else it could be, when you put it like that. You'd be surprised, Sasuke told him. With all the things I've seen over the years, I've learned to keep my mind open to all the possibilities. I see, Itachi lied. I'm sure you don't, Sasuke blithely contested. But that's okay. It really isn't something you can understand unless you've seen this shit for yourself. Okay, Itachi said. He changed the subject. So, you say I made a sacrifice for the village? For you? How so? Sasuke leveled a flat look at his kinda sorta technically older brother. The guy was born first, at least. Our clan was planning a coup, he said bluntly. I'm not entirely clear on the specifics, but essentially it was something like dissatisfaction over a perceived seclusion and marginalization within the village. Long story short, some very influential people in the family decided to try and take over Konoha, and Danzo, that troublesome old goat, believed that wiping out the whole clan was the only answer. Which seriously bit everyone so hard in the ass, come the Fourth Great Ninja War. Itachi blinked. Wait, Excuse me? The fourth what? It's a long story, Sasuke said, gesturing vaguely. And not the most cheerful one, either, even if the Shinobi Alliance did win out in the end, and even if I did get to fight alongside you one last time, thanks to the Edo Tensei. Itachi blanched. You mean you used that loathsome? No, the enemy did, Sasuke interjected. But you got hit by a Koda Amatsukami you'd crammed down Naruto's throat at an earlier time, intended for me, if I remember correctly, and it broke you out of their control. We actually fought together to stop the guy using Edo Tensei and make him release the jutsu. A pause, thoughtful silence on Sasuke's part. Not that it was all that useful, in hindsight. Most of the reanimations had already been beaten and sealed, and the worst of the lot actually knew Edo Tensei himself, so the reanimated Madara just used the jutsu on himself before he could actually be dispelled, and things kind of went to hell from there. Itachi stared at his little brother. His expression was blank, uncomprehending. Blank. That's not even close to the craziest shit that went down, either. Maybe we should start over from the top, Itachi said faintly. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, Sasuke agreed. Yo, Gramps. The Lord Third Hokage looked up from his book. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw Naruto sitting on the windowsill behind him. He smiled bemusedly. Hello, Naruto. What brings you here? The blonde shrugged. Something I should have gotten out of the way months ago, honestly. I'd intended to tell you as soon as we'd managed to regain our bearings, but Sasuke had a fit and insisted that it wait until he had a chance to talk with his brother. Hiruzen quirked an eyebrow. His brother? He said dryly. Yeah, Itachi, Naruto said. It's kind of a long story, although I suppose you already know part of it, being Hokage and all. Hiruzen hummed. Eyeing the boy thoughtfully, shrewdly, he lit his pipe and gestured for him to make himself comfortable. I hope you don't mind my umbu listening in, he said. Whatever it is you have to say. Naruto dismissed this with an airy wave. Not at all, I understand. Security first and all that. I don't mind, either way, nobody keeps secrets better than umbu. Saying this, the blonde took a seat opposite the Sandaime. I see, said the elderly shinobi. That's good. He exhaled a lungful of smoke, burning tobacco fumes meandering from his mouth in thin, white curls and wisps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarutobi smiled and took another drag of his pipe. So, what can I do for you, Go Daimedano? Naruto blinked. You're too off, he said automatically. A beat. But I'm surprised, old man, I have to admit, the blonde remarked, chuckling and shaking his head. Springing that on me so suddenly, haha. I did not expect you to have reached that conclusion, already. How'd you figure it out? Sarutobi smiled a little wider. It was an educated guess, he said humbly. I'd already ruled out the possibility of you and your friends being infiltrators, for a handful of compelling reasons. Between the apparently drastic changes in personality and sudden leaps in skill, plus a number of subtler cues, I could deduce that. Firstly, you, Sakura Haruno, Sasuke Uchiha, and Hinata Hyuga all suddenly began to exhibit vastly improved abilities surpassing even many seasoned Jonin within a few days of each other, very shortly after passing the academy exam. Secondly, your personalities had in many ways become wildly different, but also seemed to retain certain core aspects reflecting a similar fundamental psychology. Hinata Hyuga, for instance, while becoming demonstrably more confident and outspoken, still had many of the same ingrained mannerisms, showed a very similar worldview and perspective to what her academy reports suggested. Sasuke Uchiha, although seeming to open up and grow vastly more sociable within a small circle of close friends, still maintained a certain trace of darkness, one might say, showing signs of the same underlying childhood trauma, although more healthily coped with and managed. Similarly for Sakura Haruno and yourself, you were very different, and yet, there was a certain sameness at the heart of your personas, inherent qualities of Naruto and Sakura, despite seeming greatly changed on the surface. Thirdly, despite the sudden leaps in ability and changes of personality, there were at no times any indication of noticeably untoward activity. You carried out your roles as New Leaf Ninja admirably, working together with your fellow shinobi while not seeming to go out of your way to try and fit in, or blend into the background, as a spy or infiltrator might. And even if some of you clearly took umbrage at being forced to carry out menial, low-rank missions, it was not in the same spirit as a squad of restless genin eager for action. No, it was more like a chunin or jonin who has been demoted, made to perform missions for which they are vastly overqualified. Sarutobi chuckled to himself, as though recalling a mildly amusing joke. And fourthly, Sasuke, Hinata, and yourself all retain certain traits effectively unique to yourselves, things no spy would have the skill to recreate. Byakugan, Sharingan. Kyubi. Two rare Jujutsu never found outside the families of Hyuga and Uchiha, and a chakra that only one person can carry at a time. Naruto sweat dropped at this, thinking of his dad, Sora, and the Gold and Silver brothers. Not quite, he thought. But close enough, right? Hiruzen said. Naruto nearly jumped out of his seat. The third laughed. Ah, you are as much an open book as ever, Naruto, even if regrettably few people yet care to read it, he said, shaking his head and smiling. Those who are unfamiliar with you, or who are naturally poor at reading people, might not notice it, but I could see it all on your face, as plain as day. When was the last time you mouthed off to someone and shouted, "I'll become Hokage"? Believe it. Blink. Naruto's expression slacked, going a touch pensive. Oh, hell, he mumbled, letting out a bemused laugh. I hadn't thought about that. It hasn't been something I've needed to prove, or promise, or swear on for years. Again, Hiruzen chuckled. Yes. If someone tried to impersonate you, Naruto Uzumaki, even having done only the barest and most cursory of research on your personality, your past, is that not something they would have immediately picked up on? To most people, more than your poor grades in the academy, your reputation for pranks and troublemaking, or even your status as the vessel of the Nine Tails, that aspiration to become Hokage is the singular defining trait of who you are as a person. And yet, not since graduating the academy have you even once made more than a passing reference to this dream. And I know that the son of your parents would not easily be dissuaded or disillusioned. You take too much after both of them to ever give up on that dream. Not without a fight, and I am sure you would go kicking and screaming the entire way, loudly enough that the entire village would have heard it. Nostrils flared, and another exhalation of smoke wreathed the Sandaimyo's face. Indeed, there seemed to me only one reason that you might so suddenly stop speaking of that dream without my immediately knowing the cause. And that would be, if you already were Hokage. Presumably you and the other three have come from the future. I am not ignorant to the existence of purported time travel jutsu, after all. Though I am a little surprised to learn you were not the fifth. Two off, did you say? A wry grin. Well, unless your grasp of mathematics in the future is even poorer than it was in the past, that leaves two possibilities. And I am fairly certain you are not the Lord Third. A smile. So. Seventh Hokage, then. Naruto scratched the back of his neck, looking sheepish. Well, last time around you died during the Chunin exams, he mumbled. I remember that pretty clearly, because I'd been riding high on beating Gaara when I learned what had happened, and, well, it felt twice as depressing because of that, I think. Due to just how far and how fast my spirits plummeted when I heard the news. During the Chunin exams, you say? Hiruzen said, looking mildly perturbed. My, I know I'm getting on in years, but I'd thought I was in reasonably good health for a man my age, especially considering my profession. Tell me, Naruto, was it a stroke? Or perhaps a heart attack? Naruto coughed into his fist. Actually, you kinda used the Shiki Fun on Orochimaru when he invaded Konoha with the Sound and Sand villages. Although, that probably won't be problem, this time around. He added, seeing the third's jaw go slack. Since I can still feel the Kazekage alive and kicking over in Suna, and that old snake hasn't set foot on the continent in practically a month. I think that beating he got from Hinata convinced him it was time to retire. Though I suppose it's lucky for him that he at least didn't target Sasuke, this time. Sakura wouldn't have left enough of him behind to fill a matchbox, if he had. Hiruzen stared at Naruto for a long moment. He leaned back in his seat, expression slack, and numbly extinguished his pipe. After a minute spent absorbing this information, he took a slow, deep breath. So it wasn't a very peaceful era you children inherited, was it? He quietly mused. If I died killing my own student, and there were 2 other Hokage between myself and you. Naruto looked away from the Sandaime. Well, you didn't actually finish Orochimaru, he said sheepishly. Inmajiiken's the only one alive who really knows the details, and he won't even tell Kano Amura the specifics, but I figure you couldn't go through with it, either because he had been your student, once, and you just didn't have the heart, or else because old age had caught up with you and you just didn't have the strength to rip his soul all the way out of his body. You did get his arms, at least. Hiruzen hummed thoughtfully, a rueful expression on his face. A pity. He sighed. I should have dealt with him back then, before he could do something like what you said. Invading the Leaf with 2 villages at his back, and one of our allies, at that. Ah, what a crooked set of affairs this all is. In fairness, Suna was sorta tricked, Naruto said. Orochimaru impersonated the Kazekage, after killing him, and he's the one who gave the actual order to invade. And after the Sand Ninja learned what had happened, they went right back to being our closest allies. It probably didn't hurt that I wound up saving the 5th Kazekage from Akatsuki a few years later, either, along with Sakura-chan and Kakashi-sensei. And I suppose even before that, actually, Gaara kinda felt indebted to me for helping him get over himself. Wait, are you saying Gaara became the 5th Kazekage? The 3rd Hokage said. The same Gaara who's taking part in these exams, you mean? Well, he is the 4th son, Naruto replied. And Shikaku's Jinchuriki, or at least, he was until Shikaku got extracted from him by Akatsuki. He's the Shikaku's, said Hiruzen. Then he shook his head. No, or rather. I thought you said you saved him from Akatsuki? Having a Biju extracted from you. I'd always understood that to be a fatal process. Oh, it is, Naruto said. But Granny Cho was able to bring him back to life in exchange for her own. Sorta like the Rain Tensei, actually, although it seems a lot more limited. Hiruzen took another deep breath. So a child became the 5th Kazekage, then had a Biju torn from him by an organization of S-class criminals, only for you to somehow save him from said group comprised solely of individuals strong enough to stand a realistic chance at taking down Biju, and then the bitter, reclusive, and disillusioned old puppet mistress of Suna gave her life to resuscitate him. Well, she wound up needing some chakra from me to actually pull the jutsu off. Naruto shrugged. And we were only up against 2 of the weaker members, and even then Deidara basically just led me and Kakashi-sensei on a wild goose chase while Sakura-chan and Cho fought Sasori. Although Kakashi-sensei did wind up at least ripping off one of Deidara's arms with his manga Kyushari non. Hiruzen blinked. Kakashi has manga Kyu, he said. Yeah, Naruto said. I don't think he actually knows what that is yet, though. Or, at least, that he has it. But him and Obito got it on the same day, as I understand it. You don't mean Obito Uchiha? Hiruzen stared at Naruto, baffled. That boy died in the Battle of Konobe Bridge, he activated it before giving that eye to Kakashi, then. Naruto cleared his throat sheepishly. Oh, geez. I'd forgotten he was supposed to have died back then. The blonde muttered. Yeah. Pro tip, Obito's still alive. Relatedly, Madara Uchiha also survived his last battle with the 1st Hokage, and clung to life long enough to save Obito from dying back then and take him under his wing. And the 2 of them basically wound up fucking over the whole rest of the world for several years, since Obito sorta went off the deep end when he saw Kakashi-sensei kill Rin. Yeah, you know Akatsuki? That gang of S-class psychos we were just talking about? He's kind of the one pulling the strings behind that whole organization. Madara's dead now, thankfully, but Obito's bad enough on his own, and he's got a lot of very strong and dangerous people convinced that he's Madara. Left to his own devices, he'll gather up the Biju, mash them together to reform the Juobi, transform that into the Shinjuyu, and then cast infinite Tsukuyomi on the whole world. So, yeah. It's kind of a crucial detail, that Obito survived. Hiruzen's mouth worked open and shut soundlessly for several seconds. His face was ashen gray, and his eyes were as wide and round as dinner plates. You are joking, right? Trust me, Gramps, I only wish I was, Naruto sighed. Then he shrugged. Well, the Akatsuki problem ought to be nipping itself in the bud fairly shortly, either way, so we won't have to worry too much about them this time around. He inclined his head. Ah, hot damn. Konan doesn't fuck around, does she? That might be more explosive tags than I have felt in my entire adult life, and Tenten used to throw that shit around like confetti. No wonder she was so convinced she could take him out, with an ace like that up her sleeve. Hiruzen blinked. Konan. He said. What? Who? One of the rain orphans Jiraiya taught, Naruto supplied. She, Nagato, and Yahiko were actually the founding members of Akatsuki when it was just an organization dedicated to protecting the land of rain from outside threats. Back before Obito came along, sicked Hanzo on M, got Yahiko killed, then told Nagato and Konan that he was Madara and they should totally follow him. The Sandaime took a moment to process all of this, his lips twitching in a thoughtful frown. He eyed Naruto shrewdly. You can sense them? He asked. You mentioned being able to sense Orochimaru and the Kaze Kage, too, and you say Akatsuki is being taken care of. Yeah, Naruto nodded. He paused, and tilted his head. Ah, good on you, Sasuke. Thinking to include instructions for Izanami in the letter. I guess Obito must have had a spare Sharingan in reserve to burn on an Izanagi after all. Izanami, said Hiruzen. Izanagi? You don't mean the Uchiha clan's most strictly forbidden kinjutsu, do you? Yeah, Sasuke figured Obito might be desperate enough to Izanagi himself, if Konan and Nagato went at him at the same time. But, damn, I did not expect Konan to have that kind of firepower in reserve. I guess she wasn't just kept around for that pretty face, huh? I can't actually sense whatever it is you're sensing, Naruto, Hiruzen said. He noticed a strange orange pigmentation forming around the Nanadaime's eyes. The blonde gave a start at this, then scratched the back of his neck sheepishly. Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, so apparently she had like 100 billion paper bombs or something like that just chilling around in case Madara-sama ever became a liability. An appreciative hum. Definitely not just for cheesecake, sheesh. I mean, 10 straight minutes of explosions that massive? Dataro'd probably cream his pants if he saw this. She really did not trust Obito. Although he was their leader, though. You didn't make it sound like they ever learned of his treachery last time around. Naruto shrugged. Konan might have, he said. She sort of vanished off the face of the earth sometime before the Fourth Shinobi World War, not long before Obito came onto the scene with a brand new Rinnegan. He probably killed her to get at Nagato's. I see. Hiruzen said. Well, that certainly sounds. He then paused. His jaw fell open. He did the mother of all double takes. Wait. What? You just said? Rinnegan, right? As in, the mythical eyes of the Sage of Six Paths? That Rinnegan. The one and only, Naruto replied. Though it's not really that special. I mean, Madara had a pair. Nagato had Madara's, Obito used one of Nagato's, and, hell. Even Sasuke got one, after Rakudo Jiiken gave him his yin chakra. Hiruzen stared. Sasuke? Sasuke Uchiha. He gaped. He has the Rinnegan. He met the Sage of Six Paths. So did I, Naruto said. And Sakura-chan, Kakashi-sensei, plus you, the first and second Hokage, and my dad, when the four of us were fighting old Lady Kaguya in another dimension. Hell, even all the other past Kage kinda met him, when he summoned their souls from the afterlife to perform a joint summoning jutsu along with you three to get us back out of that dimension after me and Sasuke used the yin and yang chakras we got from Rakudo Jiiken to seal Kaguya and Black Zetsu away for good, where nobody could break them out. Okay, Hiruzen said slowly. Either Homura and Koharu conspired to replace my tobacco with something else, or you just said a lot of things that shouldn't make sense in any sort of sane or rational world. Naruto shrugged. Well, You four were kinda brought back to life by Orochimaru using Edo Tensei to answer some questions for Sasuke about the Uchiha massacre and what the hell a village is, and Kaguya was Rakudo Jiiken and his brother's mom, who apparently got real pissed that they were born with chakra when she'd had to break the ultimate taboo and eat the Shinjuya's fruit to gain it, and merged with the Shinjuya to become the Juobi, then got beaten by her sons. Then her body got sealed in the moon when Rakudo Jiiken was dying, and her chakra was split into the 9 Biju. And she gave birth to a third son while this was happening, somehow, and he skulked around for a few thousand years basically pulling strings and vandalizing sacred texts to manipulate people into eventually trying to reunite the Biju and perform infinite Tsukuyomi on the world, which would free his mom and send everything straight to shit. Hiruzen gawked at Naruto, looking more like a buffoon than a ninja so brilliant and masterful as to have been called Shinobi no Kami. Then Naruto blinked. Oh, ow. That is not a pleasant way to go. Weakly, Hiruzen shook his head. What? You don't wanna know, Naruto said, shuddering. I guess seeing Obito trapped and defenseless in Izanami was just too much of an opportunity for Konan to pass up. That woman is as terrifying as she is gorgeous, and let me tell you, if I weren't happily married, and also physically only 13, I would tap that so hard. Hiruzen nodded weakly. I see. He murmured. So, that takes care of Akatsuki, does it? Almost, Naruto said. Sasuke is talking to Itachi, and it feels like Kisame is about to get a visit from an old friend, on the Mizukage's behalf methinks, and as for the rest, well. What about the rest of them, Sasuke? Itachi asked within the confines of Tsukuyomi, frowning at the one-armed man who it seemed truly was his baby brother. Even if you think Pain and Konan can handle Mada, Obito, and won't just go right back to their prior activities once he's dead, that still leaves several S-class rogue ninja running around with no one to keep them in check. Sasuke laughed. That Hokage of mine may not be the sharpest crayon in the box, and Shikamaru may not have come back with us, but he's still got a pretty terrifying mind in his own right. That Naruto, while it's not like we didn't help him iron out the details, he's still probably the only one with the audacity to actually go ahead use a gambit this outrageous. Pardon. Itachi murmured. Dear Chuchikage. Yo, I hear you've been working with these jerks called Akatsuki. Not cool, man. I hear they're serious bad news. Like, wanting to gather all the Biju kind of bad news. Believe me, you don't want to get mixed up with that sort. What would people think if they found out you were providing employment to wanted criminals and S-class missing ninja? Nothing good, that's for sure. Personally, I'd advise cutting ties with them now and erasing any proof of your cooperation with those guys, before they go and piss off the wrong people. Think about it, man. Sincerely. The son of the Yellow Flash. Fence-sitter Oniki gripped the letter in his hands until it was thoroughly creased and crumpled, flying through an abandoned ghost town. He glared at the attached photo of a grinning, spiky-haired blonde boy with blue eyes, holding a Rasengan in one hand and a Hiraishin kunai in the other. Gr damn it, he muttered to himself. When I find out who's responsible for this. Tisk. To think that bastard could have reproduced. When he first got the letter, naturally he'd had the photo checked for any signs of forgery or editing. The finest experts in Iwa had taken one look at the picture, declared it 100% genuine, then taken a second look at the picture, and shit their pants in horror. It was mortifying, but if someone with access to the fourth Hokage's son knew of his past business with Akatsuki. Well, Iwa had very good spies. Oniki was well aware that the boy in the picture was the Kyubi Jinchuriki. So here he was, hunting down his most frequent contact in the organization with plans to kill them and erase any evidence of his ever employing them. Oniki wasn't about to risk the Yellow Flash finding a way to murder him from beyond the grave for working with people who were targeting his son. Akatsuki, is it? A voice rumbled, a fierce growl coming from the brush. Deidara scowled, and turned to face the speaker. He and Sasori came to a stop in a forest clearing. And what if it is, he asked. A tall, muscular, swarthy figure dressed in open white robes with an ogre-headed belt stomped into the open, bursting heedlessly from the underbrush. A blonde woman followed him, as well as a white-haired swordsman. Arms like tree trunks flexed, and dark eyes flashed. Rippling pecs sparked with a visible electric current. Criminals and defectors, is it true? That you scum of the earth have designs on the bijou, and their Jinchura key. Deidara sneered, slipping his hand into a pouch of clay. Again, so what if we are? I snarled. Then you have made a serious error, if you think for even an instant that I will abide such treachery. Darui and Yujito winced as their boss's body erupted in a shower of sparks. Or if you think that filthy turncoats and traitors like yourselves stand any chance against the fourth Raikage. Sasori blinked. Wait, what? A wave of golden sand crashed through the trees from behind the pair of Akatsuki ninja, nearly burying Sasori and Deidara alive. Not so fast, Lord Raikage. Growled a livid, auburn-haired shinobi with tanuki-like rings around his eyes. A diminutive, elderly woman stood beside him. The scorpion is mine. As the Sandaime Kage's disciple and successor, I'd never forgive myself if I let someone else kill his assassin. Deidara paled slightly. Oi, what the hell is this? He said. Sasori, my man, isn't that the Kaze Kage? And the Raikage? Yeah. Sasori, or rather the puppet Hirako in which he hid, was motionless for a moment. Then it nodded. Deidara paled further. You wanna take M, or should I? Oh, just blow them up already, you pandering Philistine. Deidara relaxed. Well, alright then. Then he blinked. Sasori, or rather Hirako, was completely motionless. Bushes rustled behind Deidara. Hirako collapsed to the ground, bereft of any will to control it. Deidara swore. Oh, no, you don't. Raza snarled. He jumped onto a floating platform of gold dust. Sasori. He and Cho took off in hot pursuit after the fleeing puppet master. And Deidara got a face full of the Raikage's fist before he could even react. Like that, said Sasuke. Itachi gaped. Are you saying a 13-year-old boy somehow convinced 3 of the 5 Kage to personally take out the remainder of Akatsuki in a coordinated assault? Is that really what you're suggesting? Well, they're all doing it for their own reasons, I'm sure, Sasuke said. But yeah, basically. I'll remind you that he is actually the same age as me, though. And the 7th Hokage. Sure, yes, but, still, something like that. Sasuke shrugged. He is scarily persuasive. Chapter 22, 6 Ways to Sunday. For a moment, Obito Uchiha was convinced he had died. It was a very long and very painful moment in which the entirety of his existence seemed to be on fire, a blinding agony which consumed him down to the very slightest fibers of his being. It seemed sure to him, self-evident and inescapable, that he was dead and in hell. He could be forgiven for assuming this, because Konan did not pull her punches, and Nagato's Izanami had left him completely defenseless. It probably would have had been less brutal if they'd simply had him drawn and quartered or flayed alive. Very nearly he had died, with his life functions dipping well below the standard baseline for several minutes, so far below that there was at least a quarter-hour stretch of time during which his heart didn't actually beat. At all. He came close enough to dying that his chakra dwindled too low for even Naruto to sense, and this was a man who could detect and discern the life energy of microbes. So that was saying a whole lot of something. However, despite all this, Obito wasn't quite dead. Technically. No, like a paragon among cockroaches, he clung to the faintest vestige of life even an hour after being left for dead in the smallest, wettest, smelliest ditch Nagato and Konan could find. Uchiha were tenacious sons of bitches to begin with, and as more than a third of the soft tissues in his body had been replaced with concentrated cell cultures from the Lord First Hokage, Obito was nearly impossible to put down. Slow to bleed, slow to die, and with a healing factor to boot. It took him a while to realize this himself, though. After what felt like a long and tumultuous epoch of horrible, soul-rending torment, lying there motionless and numb, though unfortunately not numb enough to escape the ungodly pain, he noticed that he could move one of his fingers when a weak, shuddering convulsion caused him to flinch and brush the digit against a piece of broken glass. And then he spent several seconds in a disbelieving shock that somehow, despite even his own expectations, he had managed to survive that horrible, unspeakably brutal beatdown. He was alive. Fucking alive. He might have jumped to his feet in celebration if he still had the strength to do so. Or feet. The right one, at least, seemed to be slowly reforming, but the one on the left was a lost cause. In fact, that seemed to be the case for most of that side of his body, although his heart and head were still fortunately intact. More or less. Irony, or so he presumed. Last time he came this close to death, the entire right side of his body had been all but crushed into a fine paste. He'd only survived, then, because Madara had been there to graft Hashirama putty onto that mashed and broken half of his carcass. And now because of that, this time it was the left side of his body that wouldn't be coming out of this disaster resembling anything close to functional, with his left arm and leg, and a good chunk of his abdomen, basically just gone. Probably they were a red smear on some wall somewhere in the Rain Village, a bloody mess that was no doubt being washed away in meandering rusty rivulets by the ceaseless, omnipresent precipitation even as he thought about it. Gruesome, morbid, and horrendously excruciating. That was pretty much the story of his life these days, wasn't it? Once again, he had come out of an otherwise certain death situation thanks to the modifications made to his body. He felt significantly less grateful for that than was probably healthy. Part of him wanted to just lie there and wait to die. But as he felt tendrils of questionably animal tissue threading through his perforated corpse to wrap thin cellulose cords around damaged organs, seeping as slowly as molasses through a sponge to fill the gaps and gaping holes in his mutilated anatomy, he knew that this was dreadfully unlikely to work. Not unless he waited 2 to 3 weeks, and even that was only assuming these bloody bastard plant cells were incapable of leaching nutrients from the soil. Ugh, he muttered. Ugh. Well, this was a nuisance. Not only had Nagato and Konan betrayed him, but they hadn't even had the decency to finish the job and make absolutely sure he was dead. So not only was he not released from his obligations and half-baked schemes, but now he would have to figure out some way to salvage his, or rather Madara's plans. It was about now that Obito mused on the downside of making Nagato the face of Akatsuki's leadership. While it did allow him to deflect attention from himself while he waited and worked behind the scenes, it also meant that Tendu Pain, Nagato's Deva path, was the person Akatsuki's members followed. And while that had been perfectly fine and dandy back when Nagato was just a player dancing to the tune of his pipe, now that the Uzumaki descendant and his loyal partner had rebelled, it meant that Obito no longer had any real control over the organization. That was kind of problematic. Christ. Ugh, Obito miserably groaned. How the hell was he going to get out of this mess? If he was going to continue Madara's plan, he would have to find some way to turn this situation in his favor. If Konan and Nagato chose to continue in the plans to gather the Biju, then maybe he could just bide his time in the shadows and build his strength back up until they had all the tailed beasts, only to swoop in at the last second and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. If they carried on in his plans to collect the Biju. But something told Obito that this was unlikely. Before he came along, Akatsuki had simply been an organization of freedom fighters, basically just a ramshackle militia, aside from the fact that one of its leaders possessed Madara's Rinnegan. Their only goal had been to improve the quality of life in Ame. More like a neighborhood watch committee than an extremist terrorist cell. At least by ninja standards. And now that they had figured out his role in the death of their friend, and in turning Hanzo against their little band of merry men, it seemed unlikely that Nagato and Konan would carry out the plans he'd given them. They might try to return Akatsuki to its roots, even. Hell, they might actually try to make nice with Hanzo. This was troublesome. Maybe he could try and lure some Akatsuki members away from the fold, so to speak. Even nearly a century after the founding of the hidden villages, the name of Madara Uchiha still carried a lot of weight. People feared and respected that name. That man had become nearly mythologized in the shinobi world. Nagato and Konan probably never would have thrown their lots in with some disenfranchised jerk-off named Obito. But tell them he was the Madara Uchiha, and even the man with the makings of a full-on god complex would defer. That was just how big Madara's legend was. He was larger than life. At least 1 or 2 of the Akatsuki members would probably come under his wing, that way. Kisame definitely, and Zetsu as well. That new recruit who'd just been teamed up with Kakuzu could probably also be easy to manipulate, especially if he offered the guy a chance for lots of murder and bloodshed in the name of his heathen god. Kakuzu himself would be harder. Obito Uchiha didn't really have any capital to his name, now that Akatsuki had been taken out from under him. Pain and Konan were the ones with the resources, and they could easily keep the old cynic on board as long as they paid him and provided him sufficient opportunities to earn money. Itachi was not an option, for several reasons. Not least of which because he'd seen the boy at that reunion, and knew the true reason behind Itachi's massacre of the clan. When you got down to it, Itachi was loyal to Konoha. Obito could try to pressure him by threatening to destroy the village and kill Sasuke if he didn't cooperate, but in his current state that would be suicidal. Sasori was tricky. The guy didn't really have any strong motivations one way or the other. He worked for Akatsuki because it was something to do, and gave him at least somewhat of an umbrella against assassins and bounty hunters. There wasn't much Obito could use to manipulate a guy as detached as that, and while he could probably try getting him with a reverse therapy jutsu, that could just as easily backfire. Deidara would be another challenge. On one hand, he hated Akatsuki with a fiery passion, which Obito could certainly use to lure him away from the organization. On the other hand, the guy also quite vocally hated Uchiha, and there was no telling what sort of reaction the name Madara might get from him. He might be cowed into serving him, or he might go ballistic and blow the both of them sky high. Obito sighed. Well, he was getting ahead of himself, either way. After all, he was only barely alive at the moment, and badly dismembered besides. He maybe had enough chakra to slip into his pocket dimension. But most likely he'd pass out the moment he got there, if he tried using that space-time jutsu now. Although that would be safer than lying in some ditch in a megakure. That rain coming down was linked to one of Pain's sensory jutsu, and if he waited to accumulate enough chakra to use his transportation technique flawlessly he would almost certainly become a noticeable blip on the man's radar. And that would be cutting things a little too close for his tastes. He'd be out of it for a while longer, probably, but at least in that pocket dimension he had the supplies to tend himself once he woke up. It wasn't like the members of Akatsuki would be going anywhere anytime soon. With a groan, Obito rolled onto his good side and looked into the water for a moment as he channeled his chakra. Then he blinked. Blankly, Obito stared at his reflection. He looked like ruminated shit, but that was not what caught his attention. No. He looked at his eye. His fucking eye. Not red, not black. Not a crimson iris embedded with a central pupil, supported by 3 tomo. Not a slender, tri-blade propeller churning a sea of blood. Pure gray, with concentric circles. Circles inside of goddamn motherfucking circles. He had a Rinnegan. Somehow, after all this shit, he had awakened that eye. The irony was not lost on him. Throwing his head back, Obito Uchiha broke out into hysterical, miserable laughter. Kakuzu stared bemusedly, for a moment, at the big pile of nothingness that had not a second earlier been his newest partner. A part of him wanted to laugh, seeing the one guy who'd actually seemed able to survive his rampages thanks to being literally immortal utterly destroyed with just a flick of the wrist. Of course, it was the idiot's own fault for charging someone like this headlong. One of the only limitations of his immortality was that Hidan did not heal appreciably faster or better than a normal person. He couldn't regenerate a lost limb, it needed to be sewn back on, reattached. He was pretty tough, and Kakuzu's threads were ideal for tending to any especially troublesome wounds the idiot might receive, but there were limits to what could be repaired. Honestly, given how common explosive notes and paper bombs were, Kakuzu found it amazing that Hidan hadn't gotten himself blown to bits ages ago. That immortality might be useful against people who relied on precision killing blows, or even against most of Kakuzu's worst elemental jutsu, but there were monsters out there to whom Hidan's curse jutsu and immortal body would be little more than a mild inconvenience. Some of those monsters even worked for Akatsuki. Hidan was like a child who had grown arrogant from having a halfway useful parlor trick up his sleeve. To Kakuzu, the young man's attitude was laughable. He had a nifty ability, but no worthwhile idea of how to employ it. Just because he couldn't bleed out or die from ordinarily mortal wounds, the dumbass thought he was invincible. Kids today didn't know what true power looked like. They got cocky over mastering simple jutsu and clever bits of weapon handling. These recent generations were soft and coddled. People like Hidan could never understand. Kakuzu understood power. He knew what real strength looked like, had witnessed true mastery of the shinobi arts. His parents had lived through the Warring States era, in those days of endless conflict and indiscriminate bloodshed. Kakuzu himself had served in a handful of battles, carried out a couple missions, before the hidden village system gained popularity. His parents, his family, barely large enough to be called a true clan, although they had a respectable history, joined the hidden waterfall village shortly after it was formed. They were weary of the old ways, and sincerely believed that, as part of a larger collective, they could find something like security and prosperity. Kakuzu inherited that idealism, and those hopes kindled a zealous fervor in his heart. He served the village, believing in the dreams of his parents, doing whatever was asked of him as a shinobi. In this way he rose through the ranks, earning himself a reputation for completing every mission he was given without fail. And so he was eventually entrusted with a task of the greatest danger and difficulty. A task that everyone believed to surely be impossible. Perhaps, in hindsight, they had meant it as a suicide mission. Maybe he'd risen too far in prestige and begun to worry the leadership with his sterling reputation and growing status. Or maybe they had simply been stupid and desperate enough to think it could actually be done. Whatever the case, he was given that fateful mission to assassinate the Lord First Hokage, Hashirama Senju. Kakuzu hadn't stood a chance. He'd thought himself a skilled ninja, before then, believed that he was talented, and that with enough determination any obstacle could be overcome. And Hashirama had seemed trusting, oblivious to the idea that anyone might want him dead. It was so easy to get in close, the man didn't seem to suspect anything untoward even as Kakuzu drew his dagger. But that was as far as he got. The woman beside the Hokage, his wife Mito, pierced Kakuzu with a cold glance the instant he resolved to strike. He froze up beneath her gaze. "He is here to kill you, dear." She said that to Hashirama, betrayed the purpose of Kakuzu's visit with such nonchalance that almost he had felt tempted to laugh, because of course the crazy bitch wouldn't sound worried even when a foreign shinobi was inches away from plunging a knife through her beloved's throat. But then Hashirama laid a hand on Kakuzu's wrist, and looked him in the eye. He knew true fear, in that instant. This was no mere ninja. This was not a lowly mortal man like himself. This was something else, something great and terrible and utterly beyond his ken. Ancientry and grandeur, something as old as the green forests, as deep as the oceans and immovable as the mountains. Unassailable, indomitable. Invincible. Truly and absolutely. Hashirama never even needed to lay a hand on Kakuzu. Did not have to say a word or make a single threatening gesture. That single glance vanquished the assassin, unmanned him and laid him low, robbing him of all resolution, all determination. Kakuzu fell to his knees in awe and horror. All thoughts of completing his mission, of killing his target, fled his mind. He could see it. Hashirama sat behind his desk. And behind him was a great, spectral bodhisattva, an austere god with 1,000 hands and a carven, dispassionate visage. The weight of that glance, the quiet consideration of something so immense and lofty, was enough to crush Kakuzu and press his face to the ground. He vomited in terror, trembling and weeping uncontrollably. Wordlessly begging for mercy. Hashirama dismissed him with a single, unconcerned gesture. Graced him with a slight pitying smile. That smile was more than Kakuzu's own village showed him. Disgraced by his failure, and fearful of retaliation, Takigakure's leadership resolved to have Kakuzu executed in a gesture of reconciliation. After everything he had done for the village, the unflinching loyalty he had shown them, they betrayed him over that single failure. Planned to execute for coming short of doing the impossible. This betrayal showed Kakuzu the truth of the world. And that encounter with Hashirama showed him what true power looked like. Kakuzu was well informed. He knew that there was only one man who had ever been considered even close to equaling Hashirama Senju. Hell, any schoolchild could have told you that much. He also knew that the man who appeared before himself and Hidan was one of the only people to survive a battle with that man. Fence-sitter Onaki, master of the unparalleled particle style. He and his mentor, the Null Man Mu, escaped a fight against Madara Uchiha with their lives intact. The Sandaime Chuchikage was probably one of the only men alive with whom Kakuzu felt the need to tread lightly, him, Pain, and Hiruzen Sarutobi. Those were the only three shinobi on this planet to whom Kakuzu could imagine himself possibly even marginally inferior. And of those three, Oniki was the only one whose strength he could conceivably compare to the first Hokage. Shinobi no Kami was not a title given lightly, and the Rinnegan was a power straight from the annals of myth and legend, but Oniki survived a battle against Madara Uchiha as a lowly genin. He and his master fought the only man to have ever stood within spitting distance of Hashirama Senju's power, and they lived to tell the tale. That was enough to convince Kakuzu to respect this man's power, even apart from the awesome reputation of the Jinten he wielded. And he then charged him straight on with no plan. Suicide, plain and simple. Immortality didn't mean much when a single attack could obliterate you on a subatomic level and erase every corporeal trace of your existence with the ease of swatting a fly. Humph. So much for sewing that idiot back together, Kakuzu muttered, looking up at the third Chuchikage. This statement betrayed nothing of his trepidation or worry. Oniki snorted. Don't worry, he said, forming a second cone of light between his hands. You'll join him soon enough. Kisame Hoshigaki tilted his head bemusedly when Samehata began to squirm in her bindings. She whispered to him in a voice he knew well, tied to his chakra and his blood. Told him of a familiar scent, the signature of a man they called Demon. Kisame was sitting outside the quarters of the minor noble who had hired himself and Itachi as bodyguards, covering for his partner as the Uchiha dealt with some unfinished family business. He had water clones covering every point of ingress, disguised under henge to avoid drawing suspicion. Security here was airtight, thanks chiefly to himself. But someone managed to get through all the same. Kisame smiled. Hello, Zabuza-san. Fancy meeting you here. The demon of the hidden mist held the executioner blade to his former comrade's neck. Kisame did not so much as flinch. May would like a word with you, Kisame. Zabuza's voice was low as ever, gravelly and deep. His tone was grim, serious. Kiri is cleaning up the mess it's made these past couple of decades, and you're one of the biggest spills. Kisame smiled. It was all teeth. Is that so? He replied. I must say, this is quite a surprise, Zabuza-san. I had been under the impression that you were determined to install yourself as Mizukage. But now you are taking orders from Mei-chan? My, how the mighty have fallen. I had a change of heart, Zabuza said. Not that I expect you to understand, but I was reminded of what a real Kage should be. That kid, Uzumaki. He shook his head. A thug like myself could never make the cut. I'm just here to do Lady Mizukage's dirty work. He pressed the edge of his sword a hair tighter against Kisame's neck. Not enough to draw blood, but it was distinctly uncomfortable. A lesser man would have started sweating bullets. Kisame was cool as a cucumber. So the rabid demon has become a lowly attack dog. He said. How sad. But I must wonder, if you don't think you have the power to become Mizukage, then how do you possibly delude yourself into believing that you can match this kaiju? That kind of thinking is a trap, Zabuza said, smirking. One that a ninja of your caliber should know to avoid. Yes, I said I'm not cut out to be Mizukage, but I wasn't talking about power. Frankly, I'd say we're about equal, aside from that monster you've got strapped to your back. You greatly overestimate yourself, I think, Kisame chuckled, grasping the edge of Zabuza's sword. Or else dreadfully underestimate me, if you dare to call us equals. He pushed the sword away from his neck, unbothered by the edge of it digging into his palm. Blood seeped out over the blade, and Kisame smiled as he grabbed Samehata's hilt with his other hand. Zabuza's hands tensed, and his arms flexed with effort. I wasn't apprenticed to Fugyuki-sensei for my dashing good looks, after all. Kisame started to draw his weapon. Then he stopped. Suddenly, his grip went slack, and his arms slumped bonelessly at his side. Needles protruded from his flank, his shoulders, his wrists. A beat. And I wasn't called the master of silent killing for charging my enemies head-on, Zabuza replied, affording himself a small grin. That Samehata is a frightful weapon, I'll admit, not least of which because of your mastery, but I reckon I've got a pretty keen sword of my own in reserve. A smile. Kisame, meet my apprentice. A slight, slender figure garbed in the manner of Kiri's hunter core stepped out of the shadows. Silken black hair was contained in a bun, and a porcelain mask concealed the ninja's face. Haku, Zabuza added, nodding to the hunter nin. Meet your prey. Kisame laughed. So you've got a partner of your own, do you? He mused. Pretty young, though. I dare say mine could beat yours. He inclined his head. In fighting or cross-dressing? He's a very pretty man, that Itachi. I do not doubt he could best me, in combat, Haku responded. I have witnessed the fearsome prowess of the Uchiha clan firsthand, and I know that I have a very long way to go before I can measure up to such an opponent. In combat. A moment of silence. Something like a smile might have come onto the youth's face. But Mei-sama says I can pull off a sailor uniform better than any girl. Kisame arched an eyebrow. You. He said. And Mei-chan. Now there is something I would have not expected. She likes younger men, Haku said with a shrug. And as for myself, well, I can't imagine there's a straight man alive who could say no to her. Zabuza coughed into his fist. You'd be surprised, he muttered. Sacrificial lamb? Kisame mouthed, looking from Haku to Zabuza. She was getting obsessed with finding a nice guy, Zabuza mouthed back. Scarily so. Kisame shook his head pityingly. She was always quite fond of younger men. He said. But how old are you, then? If she's picked you for her boy toy. 16, said Haku. My birthday was a few weeks ago. I see. Kisame squinted at Haku. And when is she planning the wedding for? Next June, Haku said, sounding quite happy. Kisame shook his head again. She has him bad, doesn't she? Zabuza shrugged hopelessly. I think it's an honor to be chosen as Lady Mizukage as intended, Haku interjected demurely. I hope to do her station proud and become a bride worthy of Mei-sama. A beat. I think you mean bridegroom, Kisame replied. I know what I said, Red Heart, Haku chirped. She was quite insistent on that part. Said I would look better in the bridal clothes than she would, Red Heart. Kisame's sweat dropped. I see. He turned his head to look at Zabuza. And this is the woman you're planning to bring me back to? Unless you prove uncooperative, Zabuza said, waving a hand airily. Then I'm authorized to kill you. And since Haku has already hit your pressure points, well, what do you think the prudent choice would be? A beat. Kisame was silent for a minute. Well. Zabuza said. What do you say? Kisame coughed. I'm weighing my options, he answered. She's not that bad, Zabuza said, rolling his eyes. Especially not now that she's got a boyfriend in Haku, and doesn't feel so self-conscious about being unmarried. Honestly, I was on the fence about her myself, until I really bothered to look. He shrugged. But when I did, I realized that she had the same eyes as that kid, something you can't fake or copy. Real quality, a singular purity of purpose and surety of resolve. The eyes of a true Kage. Kisame stared at Zabuza. What kid? He wondered, catching a second reference to something odd. Haku smiled. Somehow, even with it hidden underneath the boy's mask, Kisame was immediately aware of this fact. Almost the air seemed to light up with warm recollection, a nearly tangible fondness. Your partner's brother, he whispered. Sasuke Uchiha, and his teammate Sakura Harino. They were unlike anything I have ever seen. Monstrously powerful, eclipsing even the legendary copy ninja. But even they deferred to that runt, Zabuza said, that kid who could rehabilitate even the lowest and most remorseless scum on the face of this earth with a single punch in a 2-minute lecture. He chuckled. I don't know, maybe he's actually even more powerful than them, but all I saw was a dazzling radiance. Some quality that shined through even in a snot-nosed punk like him. I'd never seen anything like it. And I thought, looking at him, I couldn't help but think, that this was what a Kage should be. That next to this kid, my own inadequacy was perfectly apparent. I wasn't ready. I didn't have what it took. Next to someone like him, or like me, simple thugs like you or me just can't measure up. Strength is our only virtue. Haku nodded. Yes, there was just something about him, about his friends. That Naruto Uzumaki. So, Kisame, old pal, said Zabuza, turning to face the Piscine shinobi. What say you now? A moment of silence. I'm still weighing my options. Tisk. This is pathetic. A wave of glittering black crashed over a gilt fluid rampart. White noise, hissing, the tumultuous grating of hundreds of thousands of metallic grains rolling and tumbling together. Tendrils arched out, coils and wisps of gold and iron twining and thundering in a cataclysmic violence. Like a piece of abstract art, the Yondaime Kage's gold dust wrestled with the Sandaime's iron sand. It was a near stalemate, a fierce duel of hidden sand magnet style. Sasori stared blankly at Raza. If he could, he would have smirked. Humph. Don't blame yourself, fourth. Your predecessor's jutsu is simply too powerful for you to beat. Swirling, leaping, darting, and rushing and rising and falling, hundreds of shapes clear and indefinable, thousands of points where these fluid masses met and pushed. It was beautiful and indescribable, the contest of these metallic sands. No words could convey how subtly the substances interplayed, the millions of ways in which they were shaped and moved against each other. Like tie-dye and lava lamps, blood spatter, and stress fractures, there was a quintessential expression of chaos in the unpredictable turbulence of these wrestling jutsu. It was conceptual sumo, a battle of wills which defied literal or mathematical expression. Like water coming out of a faucet, the swirling clouds of a hurricane, sand sliding down the sides of an excavation. It was marvelous. Who said I was talking about my own performance? Raza growled out, wheeling his arms, keeping the iron sand at bay with his denser but softer gold dust. He didn't appear at all tired or perturbed as he directed his medium like the conductor of an orchestra. He stepped back and thrust two clenched fists forward. His gold dust crashed through the iron sand, a stampeding bulwark that scattered the ferric filings like leaves before a gale. Splaying his fingers, he then spread the mass of gold out in a curling tidal wave that threatened to drown Sasori and his marionette. That puppet of yours can't even compare to the real thing, Raza spat. The Sandaime's jutsu was nowhere near this weak. Lady Cho watched this display, her grandson's mother and father puppets on standby. Sasori glared and drew his own hands wide apart. Seidi Tsukai how? Fractal branches of iron lashed out, cross-beam struts and pillars catching the crashing wave of gold, distorting and disrupting it. Raza scoffed and turned on his feet, moving his arms in flowing downward arcs. His gold poured in serpentine tendrils, diving through the mesh of forked iron barbs, fingers ducking down the path of least resistance and flooding a world of ferric sand. Pathetic, he repeated. Simply pitiful. That puppet might have the chakra, the jutsu of the Sandaime Kage, but it lacks any will aside from your own. The power and flexibility of its techniques are limited by your experience and tactical prowess. He shook his head, feeling his gold sand bury Sasori and the third Kage puppet. Maybe that puppet is enough against most foes, but it's merely a shadow of the true Kage. Just a pale imitation. He curled his hands slowly into fists. But feel honored, Akasuna, for few men indeed are floated across the Styx in coffins of pure gold. The sands imploded. High above the battlefield, on a large sculpted bird, a vaguely effeminate man sat cross-legged. He was deep in thought. His flying mount dodged beams of electric blue, a laser barrage aimed to snipe him out of the sky. Okay, Datara. Let's think about this logically. So, apparently your art is diffused when it comes into contact with lightning chakra. That's kind of a big weakness when fighting two of the strongest Raiden users alive, but I'm sure you can figure something out. The clay bird dropped a few more clay bombs, mostly just to give those bastards on the ground something else to shoot at. The guy with the sword was the main problem, with that long-distance Ranton ninjutsu of his, but the Raikage and the Nibi were nothing to sneeze at, either. The fourth Raikage's lightning armor was troublesome, and seemed capable of tanking smaller explosions that were set off outside its immediate reach, even apart from automatically defusing any of Datara's bombs that happened to touch the man. The blonde couldn't use his most powerful attacks, either, for fear of instantly killing the Two-Tails Jinchuriki. The bosses would not be happy if he fucked that up. Deidara groaned in frustration. Damn it! He cursed. What the hell am I supposed to do against those bastards, if they can no-sell my basic stuff, and any attacks that might be strong enough to kill them without getting close enough for the bastards to defuse would probably kill the Nibby, too. Don't worry, came a woman's voice, interrupting him. Sit still for a moment, and I'll take care of all your problems. Deidara blinked. He turned to see Yujitona crouching on the back of his bird, right behind him. Wah! How the hell did you get up here? I jumped, said Yujito blithely. With a swipe of her hand, she sliced the bird into ribbons. Then she stepped forward and kicked Deidara in the head, sending him plummeting into accelerated freefall moments before she began to descend, herself. Chakra-like blue flames quickly engulfed her form, taking the shape of a giant Nikomata. From below, Deidara saw a panther of black lightning leap into the air. Right towards him. He closed his eyes and prayed it would be over quickly. Hey, Kakashi! Anko's voice broke the man out of his reverie, and he looked distractedly up from the voluptuous Violet's disheveled blouse and hiked skirt. He tasted wasabi in his mouth, which was funny because he hadn't eaten anything remotely spicy today. He cocked his head to one side. Yes, Anko. She furrowed her brow, and the cuteness of this gesture almost tore Kakashi's attention completely from the coziness of this supply closet, and the damp warmth of her breath on his cheek. Left-biased binocular vision eagerly drank in the sight of the woman's face, committing every detail to memory. Kakashi's hands were distractingly busy as he met Anko's gaze. Faintly, he could hear Lady Tsunade hooping and hollering as she broke out the sake. Heaven only knows where she might have found it. What happened to your sherry non? Anko asked him. It looks all funky. Kakashi frowned. Funky? Yeah. Weird. Kinda sickly looking. She prodded his chest, perhaps more to explore the bared skin than to actually emphasize her point. Could you be a little more specific? Its color is weird. The pattern, too, Anko said. All gray and ringy. Kakashi blinked. Ringy? Gray. Anko nodded. It's strange. I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure Sherry-non aren't supposed to look like that. She handed him a compact mirror. Kakashi looked at his face, ignoring the torn mask and smudges of lipstick. He stared at the reflection of his eye. That is odd, he agreed, looking at the concentric rings devoid of tomo, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single raindrop. It didn't seem like a Sherry-non at all. In fact, something about the appearance of Obito's eye dimly reminded him of an illustration he'd seen in an old storybook. What was it called? Something death-related, vaguely pretentious, Tengen? Shigen? Unbidden, he thought of Rin. Odd and faintly sobering. He cocked his head. Rin. Rin. Rin, N-E? Ah. Rinnegan, he muttered. That's the word I'm looking for. It looks like a Rinnegan. Anko blinked. Rinnegan? Sam's Arakai? That sounds awfully pretentious. You sure it isn't sick? She repeated. Because it looks pretty sick. I think you might wanna have Tsunade or someone take a look at it. It's probably just a mutation, Kakashi said dismissively. Then he shrugged, and leaned in a little closer. But, where were we, before that? Anko smirked. The fun part, of course, she purred, snaking a hand down his trousers. Kakashi smiled and took a handful for himself. Yes, that sounds about right. Something exploded, somewhere in the rec center, to shouts and raucous cheers from an assortment of drunk Uzumaki, and some distant Uchiha relatives. Tsunade crowed victoriously, and Jiraya's howling laughter resounded through the building. Kakashi couldn't care less. Itachi blinked rapidly as his eyes were uncovered. The light in the room, though truthfully a tad dim, seemed terribly bright. It was dizzying. He looked around at his surroundings, which were so crisp and clear that he felt a touch of vertigo. The change from near-legal blindness to better than 20/20th's vision was unreal. It threw him off, and he blinked again. Repeatedly. He tried reflexively to clear his eyes, a primitive and reptilian part of his brain assuming that this sudden change from its accustomed visual resolution was the result of something getting in his eyes. It registered the difference, but didn't yet parse the fact that it was an improvement. It was almost painful, this sudden ocular clarity. After so much time spent being conditioned by steadily deteriorating eyesight to squint and tense in focus, the abrupt dearth of any need to do so threw him considerably. It took a conscious effort to relax his eyes and simply look, and he felt the pang of a slight migraine. Anyone who has ever gotten a new prescription after years of growing accustomed to the scratched and degraded lenses of their eyeglasses, or after a similar length of time in which their visual acuity naturally degenerated, has experienced a comparable sensation, though perhaps not so severely as in Itachi's case. That dizzying moment when you're forced to acclimate to suddenly improved eyesight, where you look around at your surroundings and try to process the abrupt jump in resolution. It was basically exactly like that. He felt a mild headache, suddenly aware of how much he had overcompensated for his poor eyesight before now. He forced his eyes to relax, and felt a wave of drowsiness. Lids sagged, and he shook his head in an attempt to discard this weariness like a dog shaking moisture out of its fur. Blink. Blink. He looked at his brother, who smiled wanly. Sasuke's eyes were closed, a bit of blood drying on his cheeks. "You didn't have to give me your eyes, Sasuke," he said, feeling rather perturbed. "Honestly, you must know by now that I am quite ill. I don't have very long to live." Sasuke waved an airy hand. "They'll grow back," he said. "And as far as your sickness, we can fix that easily enough. Didn't I tell you? My wife is the best medic in history. Orders of magnitude beyond even Tsunade in skill. She can cure your illness, no problem." Perhaps so, but eyes don't grow back, Sasuke." "I don't think you appreciate just how good Sakura is," Sasuke said, a hint of laughter in his tone. Insert literary smishcut here. "Regrow your eyes?" "Of course I can," Sakura said, looking from Sasuke to the still disguised Itachi. She shrugged. Itachi stared. Either he was sleepier than he thought, or these two were completely insane. To be fair, he was feeling incredibly tired. "But, geez, honey," Sakura sighed, looking at Sasuke. "Did you really have to give him both eyes whole? If you'd come to me first, I probably could have activated his EMS without any need for a physical transplant." She looked at Itachi with a wry grin. Pointed at Sasuke as if to say, "What am I gonna do with this guy?" Then she chuckled, and nodded half to herself. "It's actually fairly simple, really," she mumbled, humming in the back of her throat. "Just have to trick certain hormone receptors in the brain, and spoof your ocular chakra signature. Easy as pie, to be frank." Said Itachi, at something of a loss. "Oh, right," Sakura said. "Your disease. What was it, again?" "I never said," Itachi answered. Sakura shrugged. "Well, no matter. If it has you spitting up blood from overexertion, I think I can narrow it down far enough to make an educated guess. The central problem is probably around here, or so." She placed a hand over his chest, then. Itachi saw her fingers begin to glow with chakra, and suddenly he felt his lungs clearing up. A soothing warmth spread out from the point of contact, washing over his entire body. He felt twisted or misaligned joints pop back into place, scars and old wounds tingling as they healed over with fresh skin, sore muscles loosening and uncotting. He took a deep breath, and felt none of the wet itching pain to which he had grown morbidly accustomed. He filled his lungs to capacity, and found that it did not hurt at all. There was no tingling in his bronchial tubes, no building impulse to cough cough. A mild sinus congestion he hadn't even noticed up and vanished, phlegm and mucus in the back of his throat breaking down into a negligible, perfectly manageable particulate. The slight migraine he'd been feeling faded. Even the drowsiness which had plagued him seemed to lessen, his mind clearing up as much as his vision had. He stared at Sakura, dumbfounded as he realized that all of this had happened in under a second. She hadn't even woven a single seal. She merely laid a hand on his chest and willed her chakra to act. Could that even be called medical ninjutsu? It was unreal. Itachi felt perfect. No ailments, no ills, no tiny aches or pains. Not a single negative status effect whatsoever. Like he'd just chugged an elixir, or been hit with a cure-all. This wasn't medicine. This was miracle working. Huh. He said intelligently. Wait, how did you? You're very fit. And those boyish good looks. I can definitely see where Sasuke gets it from, Sakura remarked. She looked up at him and winked. Itachi suddenly felt very uncomfortable. He said, starting to panic. Be nice, Sakura, Sasuke interjected. Don't tease the poor guy. It's not teasing, Sakura insisted. He really is very handsome. Then don't flirt with him in front of me. It's weird. Sakura rolled her eyes. You may have been back in town for a while, ever since Naruto reassigned you as a Jonin instructor, but I still have over a decade of sexual frustration to make up for. It's funny how you only started flirting like this after I came back home, Sasuke mused. A woman's heart is fickle, Sakura said airily. She always wants what she can't have. I thought that was men, Sasuke deadpanned. And what about Hinata? All vertebrate embryos start out inherently female, anyways. She shrugged. Only meaningful difference is that some of us wind up growing penises somewhere in development. And Hinata doesn't really count. She's more a case of single-target sexuality than anything else. Sakura then removed her hand from Itachi, and stepped over to her husband/boyfriend/lover/teammate. She smiled coyly. But speaking of Hinata, I really should thank that girl. The pinkette mused. Itachi watched perplexedly as a new, deeper, and denser chakra flickered to life in her core. She's a very generous woman. Giving me the yang half of the chakra she got from old man Hamura. Itachi watched as this strangely thick and vibrant energy swaddled Sakura's hand. For a moment, he glimpsed a light circle mark on one of her palms. Wasn't that just so she'd be able to claim a perfect sort of yin-yang duality with Naruto? Sasuke drawled. And I thought she gave you that chakra for giving her and Naruto the push to become a couple, anyway. Well, yes, Sakura conceded. And yes. But I refused payment, so she said it was a gift instead. If this chakra is mine by right, then I should be free to share it with whomever I may. Ha. That girl. She shook her head. And, besides, thanks to her I got to form a perfect yin-yang duo with you, Han. She placed her hands over Sasuke's empty eye sockets. Plus, you know, if it weren't for this chakra, I'd probably actually still be somewhat worse at healing than Naruto. And that would be just silly. It would, indeed, Sasuke mused. Sakura removed her hands after a second. Itachi stared, seeing his brother's eyes back as good as new. Curiously, he watched pure black orbs turn to a 3-, Sharingan, then a complex eternal Mangekyo. Then they went a step higher. Sasuke's right eye actually seemed to regress into an ordinary Sharingan, but Itachi could see that the chakra in that eye was even denser and brighter than it had been in his EMS. And the left eye became something else entirely, gray and ringed, with many tomo in concentric orbits, like the electron shell around an atomic nucleus. Curiously, Itachi felt his own eyes tingle in response. A moment later, he found his vision split. With one eye he looked at Sasuke. With the other, he saw both Sasuke and himself. Sasuke looked at Itachi and smiled. Interesting, he said. Usually I only have this split-screen eyesight going on when I make a shadow clone. But then, we do share the same eyes now, don't we? Even if your Rinnegan is on the opposite side. Itachi blinked. Well, he muttered. You did mention possessing such a jujutsu, didn't you? That I did. Now we just have to figure how to turn this shared visual field off. It's kind of distracting. Jikkyukan, dear Orion no Jutsu. No, that one sends you back body and all. Or at least it's supposed to. Ah, fair enough. How about this, then? Hiden, Anatoki no Jutsu. HRM, maybe, but that's more like a flashback genjutsu, isn't it? Not really time travel at all. The third Hokage frowned thoughtfully. Are you sure the technique responsible for you and your friends landing in this time can be found in here? Hiruzen gestured to the first Hokage's scroll of sealing, the forbidden scroll which they had unfurled across his office floor. He and Naruto were kneeling over it, scouring it for purported time travel techniques. Yeah, almost certainly, Naruto said with a sagely nod. I've given this a lot of thought. Most such jutsu were gathered up and sealed away by me. I don't know about the other Kage, but as for myself, the only alleged time travel jutsu that I didn't lock away completely were the ones located in the Forbidden Scroll. He laughed sheepishly, scratching the back of the neck. To be clear, I did put censoring seals over the entries, but I didn't destroy them completely. It's a valuable cultural heritage, after all. I could have made a new Forbidden Scroll, of course, and transcribed all of the non-time travel jutsu onto it, then destroyed or sealed away the original, but I guess I just felt a little guilty about fooling around with it as a kid. Hiruzen hummed and nodded in understanding. He flicked his eyes over a particularly unlikely culprit, Chunin Shikendei no Jutsu, and stroked his beard. What kind of censoring seals, might I ask? Uzumaki derived, Naruto said. Keyed to my blood, and the Hokage position, with provisions to decensor for trusted chakra signatures. I see. It's unlikely that just anyone could have read them, then. At least, not without your blood and the key. Naruto nodded. Yeah. Even if someone was given access to the Forbidden Scroll, they wouldn't have been able to read those jutsu without my permission. Had any been. Hiruzen said. Given exemption from the censor seals, that is. Those are mimetic in nature, to my understanding, so it's unlikely that a mere jujutsu could have penetrated it. Correct? It compels the brain to automatically censor any information related to what that seal covers, aside from merely encrypting and concealing the text. Yeah. I think that's how Shikamaru explained it. Naruto laughed. And, yeah. I have given 3 people access since I put those seals in place. For one of them, it was strictly temporary. Testing to make sure they worked, and all that. The other 2 were Shikamaru and Konohamaru. Sasuke didn't trust himself enough to accept permanent access, and Sakura and Hinata also turned it down. Konohamaru. Hiruzen said, looking a touch surprised. Naruto shrugged. At present, he's one of the most likely people to succeed me. Though some of the newer generation are also showing promise. Well, either way, Sasuke is my top jonin, and Shikamaru is my advisor, but Konohamaru is my disciple. The Sandaime smiled. Has he become such a fine shinobi, indeed? One of the best, Naruto said, grinning. Then he scratched the back of his neck. A familiar tick. And also the third or second most likely culprit for having sent us back in time. Hiruzen stared. So he is still not above causing trouble, then. Naruto's sweat dropped. No comment. A moment of silence passed. Naruto gingerly marked Kinpo, Seijin Koshinjiken Mawashi no Jutsu as a strong possibility. Who do you figure as the most likely culprit, then? Hiruzen inquired, a moment later. That, Naruto said, I think I'll leave as a surprise. He chuckled enigmatically. That's it for part 8. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.